share my screen. And, okay. So what I have here on the screen today is my very long title for my paper, but also a picture of my book. And this is a book I published in 2017, and it asks a question about popular music and the internet that I want to bring to bear on this question of scholarly communication and the informal dissemination of Saul Kripke's work. And that question is, what is the relationship about the circulation of media and culture? Is there a poetic dimension to circulation? And if there is, does it matter? And as was mentioned in my bio, what I'm really interested in is copying as a cultural technique. And my work on popular music was concerned with everyday copying practices and their relationship to forming communities of practice and perpetuating their own culture. And this book took interest in contemporary forms of expression, like disco edits put out on vinyl, made with computers and put out on vinyl, and networks of social distribution online, such as MP3 blogs in the 2000s, a phenomena that really influenced streaming culture today. And my approach compared these practices with earlier approaches and comparable analog copying practices, putting them in dialogue with one another to learn about each, an approach that I was really influenced by Lisa Gittleman's work in this area. And so I pay special attention to both the material and rhetorical dimensions of copies and copyings, to the affordances of format and format shifting. And I was really disappointed to miss Alan's Gailey's talk yesterday on format. It is directly relevant to what we're talking about today. And I really am interested in considering distribution as a culture-making activity. So as I say, I want to extend some of these ideas to a scholarly community in philosophy and the work of Saul Kripke. So this is Saul Kripke. He's an American philosopher and logician. Saul Kripke is 81, and he's currently the distinguished professor in philosophy and computer science at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. His work on necessity and possibility revolutionized contemporary metaphysics, philosophy of language, and modal logic in the 20th century. If you want to know anything about those ideas, I am not the person to ask. I am going to talk about how these ideas circulated and the stories that participants tell about those circulations. His groundbreaking work in modal logic began while he was still in high school. He published a paper, he sent a paper to a well-known journal, and it changed the field. And his status as a teen prodigy is one of the many facets of his reputation and mystique. So his ideas remain central to philosophical debate in the Anglo-analytic tradition, yet much of his work remains unpublished, and a great deal of his influence stems from the private circulation of lectures, tapes, and other unpublished works. And all I really want to do today is draw attention to the social and material conditions to how these ideas circulated and how his key books and publications came to be. And so really in putting together this talk, I've spent most of my time in the prefaces and footnotes, and I've also paid close attention to the anecdotes, these secret histories and myths that are told about Kripke as a person and philosopher, to think about the mediation of this culture. So this talk begins with a story about a particular kind of copy, the photocopy. as I mentioned earlier, because I was preoccupied with copying, I would sort of look for ideas about copying in all sorts of areas of life. And one of the ways I came to my subject was that there were issues about copyright brought about because of digital technologies and the internet, of course. And so I was, interested in thinking about other moments where copies had caused problems, debates, etc. And I found myself talking to my partner about the role that photocopies played in our own education as undergraduates in the late 80s and early 90s. And my partner, James Bucknell, who actually studied Kripke's work and kind of brought my attention to this, told me a story about how he first encountered Kripke's work. And his work, we'll pretend this was the actual photocopy he was given. It is not. He was given a photocopy by a professor at the University of Sydney who thought he was at a stage in his studies that he could read this sort of advanced work that could not be found in the library, and it was the work of Saul Kripke. And the way he told the story, it was about how it was this anecdote of being welcomed into the fold, of being given access to hidden archives, a kind of, secret society, a kind of exclusivity. It had a kind of glamour to it. But at the same time, this is a story that makes me think about the photocopy shops that sat at the edges of campus and that were really kind of horrible places with terrible lighting, and but they were so important. So it's this story that was at once kind of fantastic, a little Harry Potter, and banal. It was kind of Kinko's, and so that's where we kind of start, is thinking about this idea that Kripke's work was, and so many people encountered Kripke's work in exactly this way. One of the people I talked to told me that he went and studied at Princeton specifically so he could get access to some of these papers that you could not get otherwise. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it was also interesting because it was a story about discovery, and I was trying to figure out how could we talk about the poetics of discovery. How could the narrative of how you find out about something become part of the story of a text, an MP3, whatever it is, an artifact. And in my book, I talk about parallels between metadata and provenance, but I've more recently learned another idea from archaeology, a term I think is provariance, which is about where you encounter a place. And I thought there was something here, and you really kind of hear it when people kind of give you these genealogies of how they learn about things. So in the case of Kripke, these kinds of genealogies, these kind of how you first encounter, what was your first paper, are really key stories that people told. And I was told there's such a common stories that there's often jokes about, unearthing papers that have never before been read. Kind of jokes that write themselves, like I have one on tape that only dolphins can hear, and so on. But these were stories about how communities of scholars wielded everyday copying technologies to format shift, to take things from lectures to print, and how this distribution was culture making. And these were very much themes from my book, these ideas about copying, format shifting, and distribution that I had thought about when it came to thinking about how remix came to describe the digital, when it was a form and a practice shaped by analog recordings. They were ideas that helped me think through how we needed to understand earlier bootlegging and DIY distribution practices to understand streaming cultures and other kinds of online networked distribution. So these are the ideas I'm going to kind of look for today as I go through thinking about Kripke's work. So one thing I noticed in looking at so the thing I'm going to do is draw attention to the forms of mediation and communication that underpin these publications. So the first thing to note is that most of Kripke's formal and informal publications, his books, published papers, etc., are acknowledged by the author as the result of lectures and seminars. They are edited versions of transcriptions, often based on recordings, notes, and sometimes videos. Right? So there's nothing particularly unusual about the publication of lectures, but it is a little more unusual that one would only publish lectures. Of course, there's a precedent in Kripke's own field in the case of Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein, most of what we know of his work is the result of publication of lecture notes. But Kripke's students and followers are often quick to point out that Wittgenstein's papers were withheld to create a kind of exclusivity, whereas Kripke's not writing and is more a kind of, it's less intentional and more a case of really taking an incredible amount of time to commit. You know, the work that is in this book that was from lectures in the 70s that gets published in the 80s and again in the 90s, he says the work was really done in the early 60s. So there's just like, you know, for Kripke to commit something to print is a big deal. But I think one of the things that I kind of want to draw attention to is how these books and papers are a kind of histories of oration. They are artifacts of talking, of debate, of discussion, and teaching. Kripke gave lectures over and over and over again, so there's multiple copies of similar talks out there in circulation. And as a discipline, philosophy is often very explicit about how it values the oral and these discursive spaces. So I'm interested in how they use, but also don't talk about, media and media technologies to preserve and perpetuate that space. And I think we see this in Kripke's work. Okay, so the one thing I want to think about when I think about these artifacts of print culture is that, of course, as someone who has thought a lot about sound and media, they are very much artifacts of audio recordings. One thing that really struck me is that they were, these are books that are made of magnetic tape. When Kripke was at Princeton in the 70s and 80s, he had a research assistant that recorded all of his lectures. Throughout his notes, there is a more recent book with that's publishing some of the unpublished work called Philosophical Troubles. And in this book, I've taken a lot of the notes from this book. They're quite explicit about where the papers come from. And so this one, here are a few clippings that I've taken, and they talk about it being a transcription from tape. So I mean, there was one thing that I thought was quite interesting here is that although he might be known for his aversion to committing to print, Kripke was quite open quite early on to committing to tape, right? So we live in we're getting quite used to this sort of surveillance as academics all the time, but that was really not that usual then. But again, this idea, and he will mention quite often in his notes, you should read this and you should pretend that I'm speaking because it will be easier to understand because this was never written. He often spoke without notes at all. So he thought that you needed to think about these things as kinds of oration. So I think that's something important to think about. There's also something about the tape and its accessibility in that era that is actually parallels with my work on music, that is also worthy of note. And the Kripke Center is collecting a lot of these tapes and floppy disks and all of these things. And for me, as in media studies, I'm really interested in that kind of material history. And transcription is a key element here to the work. And in his acknowledgement of the act of transcription, we see glimpses of the community around the idea. The people who listened, the people who recorded, typed, photocopied, and circulated the papers. And I think notably, he often will know the identity. So for here, he thanks Richard Holton, Michaelis Michaels, Scott Soames for transcribing the original lecture and for the helpful comments. And I actually did have a chat with Michaelis, and he said he was, the organizers taped it, and he was given a tape, because I was kind of curious if he taped it, because that was always also going on. We see here in this other note that he does not know who transcribed it, so there's also this kind of, multiple recordings are going on, some authorized, some not. A frequent name that comes up is Professor Romina Padro, who taught with Professor Kripke this semester, and she is very much trying to work with Kripke to get a lot of these unpublished papers out and in circulation and in a state that he is happy with. So we start to see this kind of community, this kind of, it takes a village. And this is where we get this kind of invocation of this word, Samizdat. Kripke very explicitly, you can see in this note from the Wittgenstein book, refers to Samizdat transcriptions. It's a known thing. He knows that people are circulating his works. And in this other note here, what I think is really interesting, this is based on a transcript of a recorded lecture given at Cambridge in 1972. And it says the transcript appears to have been known to B.Phil students at Oxford, where it is listed as part of their syllabus. So this is a work that is not published, that has been informally transcribed and then circulated, that becomes, part of the conversation. And I think this is where we need to say that these are papers that wear their reception on their sleeve, bringing us back again to this acknowledgement that this paper has a history of being read before, in fact, it has even been published. And I thought this one is a quite amusing one here, where he was quite surprised to find out that one of his undergraduate papers, to which he had no copy of, had been circulated and cited, having handed it to his the very famous philosopher Klein, and its life went on from there. I think we'd get in trouble for that kind of thing these days. So we really have this culture, this community of people in which, this is really a story of the 70s and 80s and even 90s. But for me, I like to think about how we see these kind of everyday copying practices, precede what we see as the great moment of the copy, which is, somehow mass broadband access and access to the internet. But we see all of this kind of copying going on in kind of banal ways, but having a very significant effect on ideas and culture. We see both analog and early digital technologies being used to produce these books and publications. We see communities of interest rallying around and bonded by trains of transmission and preservation. We see myths and stories being produced, a kind of call and response, and a protection of this oral space using any kind of media technology you can. And also, I think as academics, it's important for us to acknowledge that the kind of publication culture we exist in now is not has not always existed, and that there are other parts of, I know we all know this, but it is important to think about all of these other activities that create an academic community. And Kripke is quite open about his dislike for writing. He likes talking, he likes thinking. Writing, he says, is not fun. But I think we also need to acknowledge here that this is not open access. As much as there's a kind of magical side to social circulation of ideas, like when I talk to MP3 bloggers, they just want, it was really important that people hear what they heard, and I feel like there's a little element to this in this kind of passing on of philosophical ideas. But there's also a kind of exclusivity and gatekeeping that sees people who were not traditionally part of the culture, notably women, people of color, might fail to gain entry. Philosophers are known to espouse an ideology of openness to anyone who wants to discuss ideas, but all too often we end up in a room with a lot of similar people talking. So it's worth considering who didn't get access to the copies and how an academic would decide if you were serious enough. But as I mentioned, the Kripke Center is making efforts to gather and transcribe and publish a lot of these works. And I think that there is a work that should be done with a history of philosophy, someone who does history of philosophy, about the circulation, because we really, there is really an opportunity to kind of trace this particular person's project. The irony in this presentation is that I, of course, am unable to access the archive. I am not able to leave the country. We're not allowed to leave the island right now because of COVID. I also can't access the archives because they are not digitized, although the center is in the process of trying to do those. So I would say that obviously there is a kind of funding issue to make some of this work more accessible. And I'll just end with, I am, of course, again, interested in this as a media history, a book history that reminds us of the central place of copying technologies in our recent cultural formations. Copying practices, and technologies enable and shape modes of circulation and ways of being. How we talk about these cultures and what we value are not always in line with the cultural techniques and technologies that made them possible. Kripke's not writing was made possible by a host of inscription technologies, students, scholars as Mechanical Turks, and other kinds of social support. So social distribution has a long history, one that predates the internet and has shaped many of its practices. And to understand these histories, I think, is crucial to understanding not only the present, but also imagining many possible futures. And I hope I didn't go over time. That's me. Thanks.
And thank you, Margie. You're pretty much bang on the nail for timing, so that's
Excellent.
good. Well,